Hey friends, tonight we're not just going back in time, we're going back before time had language. Together, we'll explore the deep origins of human communication, long before the first spoken words ever echoed across a forest or a savanna. Before we begin, if you find peace or curiosity in these quiet, thoughtful journeys through history, consider subscribing to the channel and tapping the like button. It really helps these stories find others who enjoy this kind of content. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing the quiet ripple of voices from around the world as we drift together through the early chapters of human existence. Now, let's settle in and begin our journey from start to sleep into a time before language had sound. Long before modern humans developed spoken language, our hominin ancestors relied on alternative forms of communication, most notably gestures, facial expressions, body posture, vocalizations, and mimicry. These systems of communication were crucial for coordinating group activities, maintaining social bonds, and ensuring survival in dangerous and complex environments. The development of communication systems predates Homo sapiens by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. Even among non human primates, such as chimpanzees and bonobos, researchers have observed complex social behaviors that require some form of communication. For instance, chimpanzees use more than 60 distinct gestures, each with relatively specific meaning, such as requesting food, initiating play, or signaling travel. These gestural communications are learned socially, not genetically hardwired, suggesting that early hominins also developed flexible, learned communication systems. Homo habilis, one of the earliest members of the genus Homo, lived approximately 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago. They possessed a significantly larger brain than their Australopithecine predecessors and used simple stone tools. It is likely that Homo habilis used nonverbal cues, possibly including gestures and facial expressions, to instruct others in tool use or to warn of predators. By the time of Homo erectus, around 1.9 million to 110,000 years ago, brain size and social complexity had increased dramatically. Fossil evidence shows that H. erectus lived in groups, migrated over long distances, and may have coordinated hunting activities. These behaviors would have required a more advanced system of communication, though still likely prelinguistic. One of the most supported theories in language evolution is the gesture first hypothesis. According to this model, early hominins primarily communicated through hand signals and body movements before the evolution of complex vocal language. Several arguments support this view. Visual communication is immediate and can be very precise. Great apes today use gestures effectively to communicate specific needs and intentions. Human infants rely on gestures before acquiring spoken language, pointing, waving, etc., hinting at an evolutionary continuity. Additionally, manual dexterity, the fine control of fingers and hands, was well developed in early Homo species. This capability likely co evolved with increasing brain complexity, enabling more sophisticated gestural systems. Some anthropologists argue that gestural communication may have included combinations of movements, much like phrases, allowing for a proto syntax that preceded spoken grammar. In addition to hand gestures, early hominins used facial expressions, eye contact, and body posture as core components of communication. Even in modern humans, facial expressions are largely universal and innate. Charles Darwin, in The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, 1872, argued that certain emotional expressions are shared across cultures and likely evolved as part of our biological heritage. Expressions such as fear, wide eyes, raised eyebrows, anger, furrowed brow, clenched jaw, happiness, smiling, and sadness, downturned mouth, drooping eyes, are recognizable across human societies, suggesting deep evolutionary roots. Early hominins likely relied on these cues to interpret emotions, intentions, and social dynamics within their groups, long before words could clarify them. Though modern language involves structured grammar and symbolic meaning, early humans almost certainly used non-linguistic vocalizations, sounds that convey emotion or urgency without formal words. Examples from the animal kingdom include alarm calls in vervet monkeys, which vary depending on the predator, eagle, snake, leopard, contact calls in chimpanzees and bonobos to maintain group cohesion. Likewise, early humans may have used grunts or yells to signal danger, soothing tones to comfort children, rhythmic hums or calls during group movement or gathering. While these sounds lack symbolic structure, they still carried pragmatic meaning and emotional tone. Interestingly, many linguists believe that prosody, the rhythm and melody of speech, may have emerged from these early vocal patterns. Babies respond to prosody before they understand words, suggesting an ancient communicative function for tone and pitch. Social learning, watching and mimicking others, was likely a major driver of communication in pre-linguistic hominins. Tool making, fire management, and group hunting all require observational learning. Mirror neurons, discovered in the 1990s in macaque monkeys, provide a possible neurological basis for this. These neurons fire both when an individual performs an action and when they observe the same action performed by others. In humans, this system is thought to support empathy, imitation, and even the roots of language. The ability to understand others' intentions by watching their movements is a critical cognitive skill that likely preceded verbal language. This suggests that early humans could read each other's behavior and learn through demonstration rather than explanation. Coordination and group behavior, group activities such as cooperative hunting, food sharing, and childcare demand coordination. Even without formal language, early humans managed these tasks through a mix of gesture, vocalization, mimicry, and shared attention. Some archaeologists propose that the development of proto-conversations, simple back and forth exchanges using gestures and sounds, allowed for better group synchronization. Research in evolutionary psychology indicates that joint attention, two individuals focusing on the same object or task, is a foundation for more complex communication. This shared attentional focus is observed in human infants and in some primates, and likely existed in early hominins as a precursor to symbolic language. Eventually, our ancestors began to move from gesture-dominant systems toward vocal speech, likely due to environmental pressures. Vocal communication works even when visibility is limited, for example, in dense forests or at night. Freed hands. As tool use increased, having hands available for tasks may have pushed communication toward sound. Physiological changes. Evolution of the vocal tract, including the descended larynx and greater control over breath, enabled more varied sounds. Brain development, expansion of areas like Broca's area involved in speech production, supported syntactic and grammatical processing. However, this transition was gradual. Gestures and vocal sounds likely coexisted for hundreds of thousands of years, with speech slowly becoming dominant as it allowed for greater abstraction and efficiency. Evidence from modern studies. Modern evidence for pre-verbal communication comes from child development. Infants use gestures long before speech and follow similar developmental paths across cultures. Nonverbal communication in adults. Even fluent speakers rely heavily on gesture, posture, and tone. Sign languages, fully developed linguistic systems using gesture demonstrate that speech is not necessary for complex communication. Furthermore, studies in neurolinguistics show overlapping brain regions for gesture and speech. implying a common evolutionary origin. Before language had sound, communication in early humans was already highly sophisticated. Through gestures, facial expressions, body language, and nonverbal vocalizations, our ancestors navigated complex social worlds. This foundation of nonverbal communication set the stage for the emergence of symbolic language. While words may seem central to human connection today, they're built on millions of years of silent dialogue, shared glances, and unspoken understanding. The development of spoken language in humans required more than just the desire to communicate. It depended on specific biological changes in both the brain and the body, particularly the vocal tract, breathing mechanisms, and the neural architecture responsible for processing and producing complex sound patterns. In this chapter, we'll explore how evolutionary changes over millions of years created the anatomical and neurological foundation necessary for speech. We'll look at fossil evidence, studies of modern primates, comparative anatomy, and genetic insights to understand how humans became biologically capable of language. Two of the most important areas in the human brain for language are Broca's area, associated with speech production and grammar, Wernicke's area, associated with language comprehension. These regions are located in the left hemisphere of the brain in most people and are part of the Parasylvian language network. Modern neuroimaging shows how these regions coordinate with others to support various functions of language, from forming sentences to interpreting meaning and tone. Interestingly, comparative brain studies show that Broca like regions exist in other primates, particularly in the frontal lobes of great apes. Although these animals don't speak, these regions activate during gesture use and vocalization, suggesting that precursors of human language circuits were present in a common ancestor shared with chimpanzees and bonobos around 5-7 million years ago. The human brain is roughly 3 times larger than that of a chimpanzee and shows significant expansion in areas related to social cognition, symbolic thought, planning and working memory, sequential processing. Key milestones: Australopithecus afarensis, about 3.2 million years ago. Brain size, about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters. Homo habilis, about 2.4, 1.4 million years ago. Brain size, about 500-700 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus, about 1.9 million, 110,000 years ago. Brain size, about 800-1,100 cubic centimeters. Homo sapiens, about 300,000 years ago up to present. Brain size, about 1,300 and 1,400 cubic centimeters. The gradual increase in cranial capacity correlates with archaeological evidence of more complex tools, symbolic behavior, and possibly proto-linguistic abilities. Especially with Homo erectus, the expanded prefrontal cortex suggests improvements in planning, inhibition, and sequencing of behavior, skills essential for structured communication. One of the most significant genetic discoveries in the study of language evolution is the identification of FOXP2, often referred to as the language gene. FOXP2 is a transcription factor that regulates other genes involved in neural development. A mutation in this gene in humans causes severe speech and language disorders. Human FOXP2 differs from that of chimpanzees by only 2 amino acids, but those changes have functional consequences. Fossil DNA analysis shows that Neanderthals and Denisovans, 2 extinct relatives of modern humans, also carried the human version of FOXP2, suggesting that speech capacities may not have been exclusive to Homo sapiens. This gene plays a key role in motor control for speech, particularly in fine-tuning the coordination of the mouth, tongue, and larynx. The vocal tract, shaping the sound of speech. Speech requires a flexible and finely controlled vocal tract, including the larynx, voice box, the pharynx, throat cavity, the tongue, the lips, the soft palate. One of the most important evolutionary changes was the descent of the larynx, which increases the length of the vocal tract and enables a wider range of the vowel sounds. Comparisons between humans and other primates show that, in chimpanzees, the larynx is positioned higher in the throat, limiting their ability to produce distinct vowel sounds. In humans, the larynx descends during development, starting around 3-4 months of age, and continues through adolescence. This change likely evolved around the time of Homo heidelbergensis, about 600,000 years ago, based on reconstructions of the hyoid bone, a small bone in the neck involved in speech. The hyoid bone does not articulate with any other bone, but supports the root of the tongue. It's essential for producing speech sounds. Fossil finds: a well-preserved Neanderthal hyoid bone, Kibera Cave, Israel, closely resembles that of modern humans. This suggests that Neanderthals had similar vocal anatomy, capable of producing a wide range of sounds. However, having the anatomy is not the same as having language. Vocal capability doesn't confirm symbolic grammar or abstract syntax, but it shows the physical potential for spoken communication. Speech also requires precise breath control, which differs significantly from ordinary vocalizations in animals. In humans, exhalation during speech is slower and more controlled. The diaphragm, lungs, and intercostal muscles must coordinate to manage airflow. This allows for long, complex sentences without gasping for breath. Research shows that trained singers and wind instrument players demonstrate even finer control, an extension of an evolved trait. In contrast, chimpanzee calls are short and explosive, lacking sustained breath control, highlighting a key physiological difference in how speech is supported. The emergence of speech in human was not the result of a single anatomical change or genetic mutation. Instead, it required the gradual and coordinated development of multiple biological systems that had to work in harmony. These systems include the brain, the vocal tract, the respiratory system, auditory processing, and motor control mechanisms. First, critical areas in the brain, such as Broca's area and Wernicke's area, had to evolve to support language-related tasks. Broca's area is primarily responsible for speech production and the use of grammar, while Wernicke's area plays a major role in understanding spoken language. Together, these regions are part of a larger neural network that enables humans to construct sentences, comprehend meaning, and produce coherent speech. At the same time, changes in our genetic code, particularly in the FOXP2 gene, provided the necessary control over fine motor movements of the mouth, lips, and tongue. FOXP2 functions as a transcription factor, regulating other genes that affect the development of neural circuits involved in speech and language. Mutations in this gene can cause severe speech and language impairments, which underlines its importance in human communication. The anatomy of the vocal tract also had to evolve. This includes a descended larynx, a flexible tongue, and a well-shaped oral cavity that can produce a wide range of vowel and consonant sounds. The positioning and mobility of these structures allowed early humans to create distinct and controlled speech sounds, unlike other primates whose vocalizations are more limited in variety. Additionally, the respiratory system had to adapt for controlled, sustained airflow. Speaking requires more than just breathing. It demands deliberate control over exhalation to produce long phrases or sentences. This is in contrast to non-human primates, whose calls are typically brief and lack breath control. In humans, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles coordinate to modulate airflow, a capability refined over evolutionary time. The auditory system also plays a critical role. For language to evolve, early humans needed to hear and interpret the subtle differences in pitch, tone, and timing of sounds. This auditory feedback is essential for learning how to speak, correcting errors, and adjusting pronunciation. The integration of these systems, neurological, genetic, anatomical, respiratory, and auditory, was a gradual and complex process. It likely took hundreds of thousands of years for all the necessary features to come together in a way that supported fluent, structured speech. Each component contributed a piece of the puzzle, and only when they were functionally coordinated did full spoken language become possible. Several theories attempt to explain why spoken language emerged. Social bonding hypothesis, Robin Dunbar. As group sizes increased, grooming became inefficient for maintaining social cohesion. Language replaced grooming by enabling simultaneous communication with multiple individuals. Tool use and teaching hypothesis. As tool making became more complex, gestural teaching may have evolved into vocal instruction to free the hands. Sexual selection. Language may have evolved partly through mate choice, with more articulate individuals favored as partners due to higher perceived intelligence. Cooperative hunting and food sharing. Better communication would enhance group coordination, improve foraging efficiency, and help negotiate alliances. The gradual shift from gesture to speech. It is unlikely that language began with fully formed sentences. More plausible is a gradual shift. Early humans may have used multimodal communication, combining gesture, facial expression, and sound. Over time, as vocal control improved, speech became more dominant, though gesture still plays a large role in modern communication. This view is supported by evidence from sign languages, which are fully grammatical yet non-vocal, proving that gesture and language can be fully integrated. The evolution of speech required a unique combination of anatomical, neurological, genetic, and behavioral changes. No single mutation or moment gave rise to language. Instead, across millions of years, hominins developed the tools for speech step by step. Brain regions specialized in syntax and meaning, genes that enabled fine motor control of speech organs, a vocal tract adapted for clarity and sound variety, a respiratory system capable of sustained, controlled exhalation. All of these laid the groundwork for symbolic vocal language, one of the defining traits of Homo sapiens. The emergence of spoken language was not a sudden event, but a long evolutionary transition from simpler forms of communication. In this chapter, we examine the intermediate stages between nonverbal communication and full linguistic expression. These stages likely included a combination of gesture, facial expression, vocal sound, and imitation, all of which help lay the groundwork for symbolic thought and structured language. Long before humans developed structured speech, early hominins communicated using multimodal signals, that is, signals involving multiple channels at once. These likely included hand gestures, facial expressions, postural cues, nonverbal vocalizations, for example, grunts, laughs, cries. Modern primates offer insight into this phase. Chimpanzees and bonobos, for example, use intentional gestures in combination with vocalizations. A chimpanzee might extend its hand to request food, then grunt or make eye contact to reinforce the request. These actions are goal-directed and flexible, often adjusted depending on the response of the other individual. This suggests that our last common ancestor with chimpanzees, living around 5 to 7 million years ago, may have also relied on a gesture-first system of communication, supported by vocal sounds and facial cues. One widely supported hypothesis in language evolution is the gesture-first theory. According to this model, language originated from manual gestures rather than from vocalizations. Support for this theory comes from several lines of evidence. Sign languages are fully capable of expressing complex grammar and abstract concepts, proving that spoken sound is not required for linguistic structure. Mirror neuron systems, discovered in macaques and also present in humans, are activated both when performing an action and when observing someone else perform it. This system likely evolved to support imitation and understanding of gestures, a precursor to shared meaning. Child language development also supports this view. Infants typically gesture, such as pointing, before they speak, suggesting that the brain is wired to build meaning through physical movement before vocal symbols are learned. Thus, gestures may have served as the original symbolic system, gradually giving way to speech as vocal control improved and freed up the hands for other tasks like tool use. The ability to imitate sounds is essential for language learning. Most animals cannot mimic arbitrary sounds, but humans and a few other species such as songbirds and dolphins can. This capacity for vocal imitation likely evolved in stages. Among great apes, vocal imitation is limited. However, some studies have shown that orangutans and bonobos can learn to control their calls and modify them based on social context. For instance, an orangutan in captivity learned to whistle spontaneously, and others have been observed mimicking human-made sounds. In humans, vocal imitation became tightly connected to social learning. Infants begin imitating the sounds of adults within the first year of life. This imitation process is critical not only for learning specific words, but also for internalizing the phonological system of the native language. This ability required fine motor control over the larynx and tongue, auditory feedback to compare one's own output with what is heard, neural pathways connecting auditory and motor systems, especially in the arcuate fasciculus. The coevolution of perception and production of sounds likely created a feedback loop that accelerated language development. Even before words had fully abstract meanings, early humans may have used sound symbolism, a phenomenon in which certain sounds are naturally associated with particular meanings. For example, the Kiki Booba effect, found across cultures, shows that people consistently match spiky shapes with the sound Kiki and round shapes with Booba. Words like sniff, buzz, or click imitate the sound of the action they describe. These are known as onomatopoeic forms. Many indigenous languages contain ideophones, words that convey sensory imagery through sound, such as movement, texture, or emotion. This suggests that early proto-words may have emerged from iconic vocalizations, which were more intuitive and easier to remember than arbitrary symbols. Over time, such vocalizations could become conventionalized within groups, forming the roots of shared vocabulary. Human language depends not only on the biological capacity to produce and perceive sounds, but also on the cultural transmission of knowledge. Unlike most other species, humans teach each other how to speak and use language. Key points. Infants are born with universal phonetic sensitivity, meaning they can distinguish sounds from all the world's languages. This ability narrows within the first year based on the sounds they're exposed to. Caregivers exaggerate and simplify speech when talking to infants. This is known as infant-directed speech or motherese. It plays a crucial role in teaching the sound structure and rhythm of the language. Imitation and reinforcement are central. Children learn through constant interaction, correction, and modeling from adults and peers. This social learning process likely has deep evolutionary roots. Even in hunter-gatherer societies today, language is taught through interaction, not formal education. This supports the view that language is primarily a social adaptation designed to coordinate behavior and transmit information across generations. Emergence of the first symbols. Language requires the use of arbitrary symbols, sounds or gestures that refer to things, actions or concepts. The leap from indexical signs, direct associations, to symbolic reference, arbitrary but agreed upon meaning, was a turning point in cognitive evolution. Archaeological evidence provides clues about when symbolic thinking emerged. The earliest known engraved ochre pieces, dated to around 75,000 years ago, Blombos Cave, South Africa, show cross-hatch patterns likely made intentionally for symbolic purposes. Beads and ornaments appear around the same time in Africa and the Levant. These objects had no functional purpose but served as markers of identity or status. Cave art, beginning at least 40,000 years ago, shows the ability to represent animals, human figures, and possibly abstract concepts. These developments suggest that early humans had begun to form mental representations of things not immediately present, an ability crucial to language. The use of symbolic tools likely co-evolved with language. Both require representational thought, planning, and memory, and both benefit from shared conventions passed down socially. As groups grew larger, spoken communication needed to be standardized to remain effective. This led to the emergence of shared vocal conventions, sounds, and words that held the same meaning for all members of the group. This standardization served several functions: efficient cooperation in hunting, gathering, and caregiving, group identity and cohesion, distinguishing us from them, transmission of culture, stories, and norms across generations. Evidence from modern tribal languages shows how small communities develop distinct dialects that are strongly tied to identity. Some indigenous groups can identify someone's village or family based on subtle pronunciation differences. This implies that early human speech may have varied between groups, forming early proto-languages, each with its own sounds, meanings, and grammatical tendencies. Even today, gesture remains closely tied to speech. People naturally move their hands when they speak, and gestures often carry meaningful information. In fact, research has shown that gestures aid in memory and help listeners understand better. Speakers gesture even when on the phone, with no visual audience. In bilinguals, gestures can change depending on the language spoken. This suggests that gesture and speech evolved together rather than one replacing the other. As vocal communication became more prominent, gestures became supplementary, but they never disappeared. This continuity supports the view that spoken language evolved on top of a gestural foundation, which was never fully abandoned. While gestures, vocal imitation, and symbolic sounds mark critical steps towards spoken language, true language as we know it requires something more: syntax, the rules that govern how words are organized into meaningful sentences. This chapter explores how early human communication evolved from simple proto-language to complex, rule-based grammar. A proto-language is a hypothetical, intermediate stage of communication that existed before fully developed grammar and syntax emerged. It is more advanced than simple calls or gestures, but less structured than modern human language. Features of proto-language likely included isolated words or sound symbol associations, no consistent word order, minimal or no inflectional morphology, no tenses, plurals or cases, highly context-dependent meaning. Modern analogies include the speech of toddlers before full grammar develops. For example, want juice instead of I want some juice. Communication by home signers. Deaf individuals who invent their own gestural systems without exposure to formal sign language. Pidgins, which emerge when speakers of different languages need to communicate and create simplified systems with limited grammar. These examples help us reconstruct what early human communication might have looked like before grammar evolved. The role of working memory. One of the critical challenges in language evolution was the development of working memory, the capacity to hold and manipulate multiple items in the mind at once. Syntax requires not only recognizing words, but also tracking their relationships across time. For instance, consider the sentence, The man who the dog chased was angry. Understanding the sentence requires holding on to the subject, the man, identifying the embedded clause, who the dog chased, and then resolving the main verb, was angry. This level of complexity is impossible without sufficient memory capacity and the neural control. Research suggests that prefrontal cortex expansion in Homo sapiens allowed for better sequencing, memory buffering, and planning, abilities essential for both tool use and syntactic processing. Grammaticalization, from words to structure. The process by which structure emerges from unstructured communication is known as grammaticalization. This involves the transformation of lexical items, content words, into grammatical markers over time. Examples include the transformation of going to into gonna, marking future tense, nouns becoming case markers or prepositions, verbs evolving into auxiliaries. Grammaticalization typically follows these stages. Semantic bleaching. The word loses its original, full meaning. Phonetic reduction. The word becomes shorter and less distinct. Obligatorification. The word becomes a required part of sentence structure. Fixation. It becomes rigidly placed in certain syntactic environments. In early languages, grammaticalization likely began when frequent word combinations became standardized through repetition and shared usage, eventually forming grammatical rules. One of the major breakthroughs in language evolution was the emergence of consistent word order. While modern languages vary, for example, subject, verb, object in English versus subject, object, verb in Japanese, they all enforce some structure. Consistent word order allows listeners to identify agents and actions, understand who is doing what to whom, predict upcoming information. In proto-language, the order may have been flexible or inconsistent, but as more concepts were introduced, ambiguity became a problem. To resolve this, early speakers may have started relying on fixed patterns, such as always putting the actor first or the object last. For example, proto-stage, eat berry man, ambiguous. Later stage, man eat berry, subject verb, object. Cognitive pressures likely drove this change. Languages that used more predictable structures would have been easier to learn and interpret, giving groups a selective advantage. Perhaps the most defining feature of human syntax is recursion, the ability to embed structures within other structures. Examples of recursive structures: the dog that chased the cat that climbed the tree barked loudly. He said that she thought that I knew that. Recursion allows for infinite expression with finite means. A finite vocabulary can generate unlimited ideas and relationships. This property is absent or extremely limited in non-human communication. The development of recursive thought likely required prefrontal cortex expansion, advanced theory of mind, the ability to model what others are thinking. Exposure to complex narrative structures within social groups. Some linguists, such as Noam Chomsky, argue that recursion is the core feature of universal grammar. Others see it as the final product of multiple interacting cognitive mechanisms. Grammar is not innate in the form of fixed rules, but it does depend on a human brain prepared to learn structure. Children don't need explicit instruction to acquire grammar. They infer patterns from the language used around them. Key mechanisms include pattern recognition. Infants are highly sensitive to statistical regularities in sound sequences. Bootstrapping. Children use cues like word position and intonation to infer word categories, noun, verb, etc. Peer interaction. Children reinforce grammatical norms through constant feedback in social settings. Crucially, grammar emerges even in the absence of a model. In the case of Nicaraguan Sign Language, deaf children invented a full grammar within 2 generations after being brought together in schools. The first cohort used simple signs. The next added consistent word order and markers. This is powerful evidence that the human brain actively seeks structure and imposes it on communicative input. Modern neuroimaging studies have identified specific brain regions involved in syntactic processing, Broca's area, involved in sentence structure, agreement, and grammar construction, Wernicke's area, linked to lexical access and semantic processing, arcuate fasciculus, a fiber tract connecting Broca's and Wernicke's areas, essential for coordinating language comprehension and production. Damage to these regions causes well documented language deficits. Broca's aphasia, halting, effortful speech with poor grammar, though comprehension may remain intact. Wernicke's aphasia, fluent but nonsensical speech with poor comprehension. These findings suggest that grammar relies on a specialized, lateralized neural system, mostly in the left hemisphere. However, right hemisphere regions also support aspects of prosody and discourse level organization. This specialized neural circuitry likely evolved gradually from more general purpose cognitive systems that were repurposed or exapted for language use. From communicative need to complexity. Why did the grammar evolve? One likely reason is the increasing complexity of human society. As social groups grew larger and more structured, communication needed to handle more individuals and roles, for example, kinship, leadership, alliances, more abstract topics, for example, past events, hypothetical plans, moral norms, more types of actions and events. Vocabulary alone could not convey all this information. Grammatical structures allowed early humans to specify who did what to whom, mark time, certainty, and intention, combine multiple ideas into a single, cohesive message. Languages became more complex because the information needs of speakers became more complex. Over generations, this pressure led to the refinement of syntax, morphology, and grammatical categories like tense, aspect, mood, and number. Grammar and syntax did not appear overnight. They evolved from simple combinations of meaningful sounds, gradually acquiring structure through repeated use, cultural transmission, and cognitive development. Key milestones in this transition include the emergence of proto-language based on isolated words or signs, development of working memory and symbolic sequencing, introduction of fixed word order and grammatical markers, appearance of recursive syntax and embedded clauses, cultural mechanisms for teaching and generalizing patterns. This transformation from context-dependent signaling to fully structured syntax enabled humans to communicate with precision, abstraction, and creativity. It marked the turning point from communication to true language, culture, and the rise of narrative. As grammar and syntax became increasingly complex, language evolved into more than a tool for signaling immediate needs. It became a mechanism for transmitting cultural knowledge, coordinating group behavior, and sharing abstract ideas. One of the most transformative consequences of this development was the emergence of narrative, the ability to tell stories. In this chapter, we examine how the rise of language supported the growth of culture and how the human capacity for narrative became a foundational aspect of society. Language enabled humans to store and transmit knowledge far beyond what a single individual could observe or remember. Unlike visual cues or basic calls, linguistic communication allowed early humans to describe past events, predict future scenarios, and articulate hypothetical situations. This capacity had profound implications. It meant that useful information about predators, hunting strategies, social alliances, or seasonal changes could be shared across generations, forming the basis of cumulative cultural evolution. The storage of knowledge was no longer dependent solely on memory or imitation. Through spoken language, knowledge could be encoded symbolically and retained in oral tradition. The earliest uses of narrative were likely simple and utilitarian. Early stories may have revolved around explanations for natural phenomena, accounts of successful hunts, or recollections of dangerous encounters. These stories were not fiction in the modern sense, but they introduced the basic narrative elements, characters, events, consequences, and moral implications. Narrative allowed groups to model cause and effect, reinforce social norms, and create shared understanding. Through, through repeated storytelling, behaviors could be encouraged or discouraged, and reputations could be constructed or challenged. In this way, language became a social regulator, as well as a medium for entertainment and learning. From an anthropological perspective, all known human societies, regardless of technological level, possess some form of storytelling. Oral traditions exist in hunter gatherer communities, agricultural societies, and industrial civilizations alike. This universality suggests that narrative is not a recent cultural invention, but a deep rooted feature of the human mind. It also implies that the evolution of language was closely tied to the emergence of a narrative instinct. Some researchers argue that our brains are wired for narrative cognition. When presented with disconnected events, humans naturally construct causal links and interpret them as stories. This may be an evolutionary adaptation that helps us make sense of complex social environments. Neurologically, the processing of narrative engages multiple regions of the brain, including the default mode network, which is associated with memory, imagination, and the projection of self into other perspectives. These functions are closely linked to what is known as theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others. Theory of mind is essential for understanding characters' motivations and stories, but it is also critical for daily social interactions. Language and narrative likely co-evolved with these cognitive capacities. As humans became better at modeling the thoughts and intentions of others, they also became more skilled at constructing and interpreting stories. The emergence of narrative also had implications for group cohesion and identity. Stories became a way to define who belonged to a group and what that group valued. Myths, origin tales, and heroic accounts often served as the foundation of shared belief systems. These narratives reinforced group boundaries and justified social hierarchies, laws, and rituals. Over time, stories were integrated into religion, ethics, and cosmology. While early narratives may have been transmitted informally around the campfire, they eventually became more formalized as chants, songs, and oral epics. One of the most interesting features of narrative is its flexibility. While language requires structure, storytelling allows for creativity and variation. A single story can be adapted to fit different audiences, situations, or moral lessons. This adaptability makes narrative an ideal tool for cultural transmission. In fact, much of pre-literate human history is preserved through oral storytelling. In some societies, oral historians or elders memorize vast bodies of knowledge, including genealogies, laws, and rituals, and pass them on verbatim or with controlled variation. This system of transmission required not only linguistic skills, but also mnemonic techniques, such as rhythm, repetition, and symbolic association. As language and narrative abilities evolved, they supported the emergence of increasingly complex forms of culture. Cultural practices such as tool making, social rituals, and moral codes began to accumulate across generations. Language allowed these practices to be preserved, shared, and refined. This phenomenon, known as cumulative culture, is unique to humans. While some animal species transmit behaviors socially, the complexity and durability of human culture depend heavily on linguistic communication. Without language, culture would fragment and reset with each generation. With language, it becomes a collective memory that can expand indefinitely. The rise of narrative also allowed for the development of fiction and imagination. Once humans could describe events that did not actually happen, they could begin to explore alternate realities, symbolic representations, and metaphorical ideas. This marked the beginning of myth making and abstract thinking. Fictional stories often reflect deep truths about human experience, even when their events are not literally real. They help listeners understand emotions, dilemmas, and social expectations through symbolic scenarios. In this way, fiction became a tool for exploring possibilities and rehearsing decisions. It also provided emotional catharsis and entertainment. Evidence for the importance of narrative in early human culture can be found in archaeological discoveries. Cave paintings, such as those found in Lascaux or Chauvet, do not simply depict animals, they often represent sequences, hunting scenes, or symbolic relationships that suggest storytelling. Similarly, figurines and ritual artifacts may have been used as visual aids in oral narratives or ceremonial recitations. The repetition of certain motifs across regions and time periods indicates that stories were passed between groups and possibly maintained for thousands of years. The expansion of storytelling coincided with the evolution of more stable social groups and eventually the emergence of tribal and chiefdom societies. As populations grew, stories helped establish common values and explain collective experiences. They also helped negotiate power and authority. Leaders often justified their position through myths of divine ancestry, historical victories, or prophetic visions. These stories legitimized social structures and resolved conflicts by appealing to shared symbolic frameworks. In this way, narrative functioned as both a mirror and a mechanism of social order. As language became more abstract, it allowed for the development of metaphors, analogies, and layered meanings. These linguistic tools enhanced the expressive power of narrative and enabled complex argumentation, persuasion, and emotional nuance. The ability to speak metaphorically is a key feature of human cognition. It allows us to conceptualize time as space, ideas as objects, and relationships as physical connections. Such metaphors are embedded in virtually all languages and reflect how language shapes thought. Storytelling also became a way to manage uncertainty and explain the unknown. Before the development of scientific reasoning, humans used stories to account for natural disasters, illness, death, and other unexplained phenomena. These explanations were not necessarily irrational, they provided psychological comfort and practical advice within the limits of available knowledge. Over time, some of these stories evolved into religious doctrines and philosophical systems. Even today, narrative remains central to religious practice and moral reasoning. Importantly, the power of narrative lies not only in its content, but in its structure. Research shows that stories with clear causality, tension, resolution, and emotional engagement are more memorable and persuasive than lists of facts or instructions. This narrative structure likely evolved because it aligns with how the human brain organizes information. Through stories, abstract information becomes embodied in specific agents, actions, and consequences. This makes it easier to understand, remember, and apply. In modern societies, narrative continues to shape education, politics, law, and media. From courtroom arguments to marketing campaigns, stories are used to influence decisions and construct identities. This is not a recent development, but a continuation of the same evolutionary processes that began tens of thousands of years ago. Language enabled us to share information. Narrative enabled us to shape meaning and values collectively. Ultimately, the rise of narrative transformed language from a functional tool into a cultural engine. It enabled humans to create shared histories, imagine futures, and understand one another across time and space. Without narrative, language would remain limited to immediate reference and instruction. With narrative, it becomes a vehicle for culture, memory, morality, and imagination. The origins of language diversity. Once early humans developed fully functional language systems with syntax, grammar, and narrative capability, language did not remain a single, uniform entity. Instead, it began to diversify rapidly, giving rise to the thousands of languages spoken around the world today. This chapter explores why and how human language diverged into such a vast array of distinct forms, even though all languages share the same underlying cognitive foundation. The roots of language diversity lie in population dynamics. As early human groups migrated, split, and settled in different ecological regions, their languages naturally began to change. Much like biological evolution, linguistic evolution is shaped by isolation, variation, and adaptation. When groups were geographically or socially separated, their modes of speech gradually diverged. Even small shifts in pronunciation, vocabulary, or grammar could accumulate over generations, eventually making the speech of neighboring groups mutually unintelligible. One major factor contributing to this divergence is that language is learned, not genetically inherited. Children learn the language they're exposed to, and this introduces a constant potential for change. Slight errors, innovations, or preferences can become entrenched if they spread across a speech community. Over time, the accumulation of such changes results in a new dialect or even a distinct language. Because humans are creative and language is flexible, this process happens continuously. The earliest major splits likely occurred alongside human migrations out of Africa. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that humans began dispersing across the globe around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. As they settled in Europe, Asia, and eventually the Americas and Oceania, their languages diversified in parallel with their cultural and environmental adaptations. For example, isolated populations in Papua New Guinea, which has rugged terrain and limited contact between groups, now speak over 800 distinct languages in a relatively small area. Another important driver of linguistic diversification is social identity. Language is not just a tool for communication, it is also a marker of group membership. People often alter their language to signal affiliation, status, or cultural alignment. This can lead to deliberate differentiation, especially in competitive or hierarchical societies. Linguistic features become symbols of belonging, and dialectal distinctions may be reinforced by tradition, ritual, or resistance to outside influence. In this way, language becomes a medium for both communication and boundary making. Contact between languages can also drive change and diversification. When speakers of different languages interact through trade, conquest, or migration, new forms can emerge. One example is language borrowing, where words, sounds, or grammatical structures from one language are absorbed into another. Over time, this can produce hybrid systems or even entirely new languages. In extreme cases, when people with no shared language are forced to communicate, pidgins may develop. These simplified contact languages can evolve into creoles if children begin learning them natively, complete with full grammar and expressive power. Despite all this variation, all human languages share certain universal features. They all use discrete units, such as sounds or signs, hierarchical structure, such as phrases and clauses, and rules that govern meaning. These linguistic universals suggest that our capacity for language is shaped by shared cognitive and anatomical constraints, even as the surface forms of language vary wildly. The field of typology studies these patterns, comparing word orders, case systems, tense structures, and more across hundreds of languages. The existence of language families also helps us trace how languages have evolved over time. Just as species are grouped into evolutionary trees, so too are languages. For instance, the Indo-European family includes languages as diverse as English, Hindi, Russian, and Persian, all of which descended from a common ancestral language spoken over 5,000 years ago. Linguists use a method called comparative reconstruction to identify shared roots and infer the features of now lost proto-languages. The rapid evolution of language diversity shows that language is both robust and plastic. It remains stable enough to be passed on, yet flexible enough to adapt to changing environments, social structures, and contact situations. In this way, the emergence of language diversity is not a deviation from the language instinct. It is a direct consequence of it. The human brain is wired to acquire any language, and every generation reinvents its own version. However subtly, this makes linguistic change inevitable. Today, linguistic diversity is under threat. Globalization, mass media, and dominant languages like English or Mandarin are displacing smaller local languages at an alarming rate. Thousands of languages are at risk of extinction within the next century. This matters not only for cultural reasons, but because each language encodes unique ways of thinking, classifying, and interacting with the world. Language diversity reflects the full range of human experience, and understanding its origins helps us appreciate what may be lost. In summary, language diversity emerged because human populations dispersed, became isolated, and continually reinvented their systems of communication. Social identity, contact with other languages, and the plasticity of language learning all contributed to the formation of new dialects and languages. Yet beneath this surface level variation lies a universal capacity for language that unites all human beings. Understanding this tension between unity and diversity is key to understanding how language has evolved as both a biological capacity and a cultural phenomenon. The role of gesture and sign in language evolution. Long before humans possessed the ability to produce structured speech, communication was already flourishing through the silent language of the body. Gestures, facial expressions, and manual signs form the earliest foundation of human interaction. For millions of years, these nonverbal signals allowed our ancestors to share intentions, convey emotions, and coordinate social life in the absence of spoken words. Modern research offers compelling evidence for the central role of gesture in the origins of language. Among our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos use intentional gestures to request help, initiate play, or demand attention. These gestures are not fixed but context sensitive and learned through social interaction. This flexibility implies that early hominins likely developed a gestural repertoire of their own, an evolving vocabulary of bodily signs that could be adapted, combined, and refined. One of the most influential theories in language evolution is the gesture first hypothesis. It posits that language began as a visual manual system before humans had the anatomical or neurological capacity for speech. They already possessed fine motor control in their hands and fingers. This dexterity, paired with increasing social complexity, enabled early hominins to develop sophisticated gestural systems. These systems may have included sequences of movements, allowing for a rudimentary proto-syntax long before spoken grammar evolved. Human infants mirror this evolutionary sequence. They gesture, pointing, waving, reaching, well before they speak. These early signs are not mere reflexes, they are deliberate communicative acts, shaped by cultural input and social reinforcement. This developmental trajectory strongly suggests that gesture is foundational to language acquisition and evolution alike. Further supporting this view is the existence of sign languages, which demonstrate that full linguistic expression is possible without sound. Sign languages are not merely pantomimes, they have complex grammar, abstract concepts, and recursive structures. They show that the brain is not hardwired exclusively for speech, but for language, regardless of the modality. Gesture and sign also engage brain regions traditionally associated with the spoken language, most notably Broca's area, involved in grammar and sequencing. This overlap hints at a shared evolutionary pathway and a multimodal neural architecture for communication. Even today, gestures remain an integral part of language. People gesticulate while talking, often subconsciously. These movements enhance comprehension, aid memory, and even persist during phone calls when no visual audience is present. In bilingual individuals, gestures can shift depending on the language being spoken, revealing deep ties between physical expression and linguistic structure. Rather than being replaced by speech, gestures became intertwined with it. As vocal control improved and environmental conditions favored auditory signals, spoken language gradually took precedence. Yet gestures never disappeared, they evolved alongside speech, forming a dual channel system of communication that remains fundamental to human interaction. Thus, the role of gesture and sign in language evolution is not peripheral, but central. It was through the hands and face that early humans first broke the silence, laying the groundwork for the spoken word. The story of human language begins not with spoken words, but with movement, mimicry, and emotion. Long before Homo sapiens could speak, our ancestors communicated through the body, pointing, gesturing, posturing, and mimicking, silent yet expressive tools that shaped the earliest human interactions. This form of communication wasn't unique to humans. Modern primates, such as chimpanzees and bonobos, also rely on gestures, facial expressions, and vocal calls to coordinate behavior and express intentions. These parallels suggest a deep evolutionary lineage stretching back millions of years, shared with our closest relatives. Early hominins like Homo habilis and Homo erectus likely used gestures and nonverbal cues to teach tool use, warn of danger, and maintain social cohesion. Over time, these rudimentary systems evolved into more flexible, socially learned forms of communication. Visual gestures provided clarity, precision, and emotional context. Manual dexterity and the growing complexity of social life favored increasingly structured gestures, some of which may have even resembled proto syntax. Facial expressions, too, played a crucial role. Universally recognized displays of fear, joy, anger, and sadness offered insight into emotional states long before words could describe them. These expressions were not just social signals, they were survival tools, helping individuals navigate the social group and avoid danger. Yet gestures alone were not enough. In dense forests or nighttime settings where visibility was poor, auditory signals gained an advantage. Early vocalizations, grunts, hums, cries, emerged to fill the gaps left by gesture. While not symbolic in structure, these sounds conveyed emotion and urgency, hinting at an eventual transition towards spoken language. This shift was likely slow and incomplete at first, with gestures and sounds coexisting for the millennia. Gradually, changes in anatomy and neurology made vocal language possible. The descent of the larynx, improved breath control, and expanded brain regions like Broca's and Wernicke's areas enabled greater vocal variety and syntactic capacity. Genetic adaptations, particularly in the FOXP2 gene, fine-tuned motor control over speech organs. What followed was the birth of symbolic speech, a leap that would forever distinguish humans from other species. But even this transition did not erase the foundation laid by nonverbal communication. Modern humans still rely on gesture, posture, and tone. Sign languages thrive in deaf communities, proving that speech is not necessary for grammar. Children acquire gestures before words. Adults unconsciously gesticulate while speaking. These behaviors reveal a lingering legacy. one in which the silent language of our ancestors remains etched into every conversation we have today. In the end, human language was never a sudden invention, but a slow, layered evolution. It arose from the body before the voice, from shared glances before shared words. The first languages were not spoken, they were seen and felt, and through them early humans began to build meaning, memory, and culture long before they found the sound to match. And so, from silent gestures to spoken words, from ancient minds to modern language, we've traced the long, quiet path our ancestors walked to give voice to thought. If this journey helped you unwind or drifted you a little closer to rest, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next chapter. Until then, sleep well, and thank you for joining us from start to sleep.